Okay, so Dr. K here, and on to the next module where we're going to talk about endocrine conditions. We're going to discuss a variety of different diseases that can happen to the endocrine system, and as well, we're going to discuss the different types of diabetes that patients can develop. So the endocrine system is really an amazing system. It's a set of glands that secrete hormones directly into the bloodstream. Unlike the exocrine system that secretes, say, digestive enzymes into ducts that then travel, say, into the digestive system. When we're talking about the pancreas, for example, where it has an exocrine function that allows it to secrete digestive juices into the gastrointestinal tract, but the pancreas also has an endocrine function where it can secrete directly into the bloodstream hormones such as glucagon and insulin. Okay, so when we look at the endocrine system, we're going to be looking at a lot of the organs that you see in this image. The hypothalamus and the pituitary gland that have a very big role in controlling other organs, other glands throughout the body. Okay, so we're going to see that a lot of control comes from the hypothalamus, which is part of the brain, and the pituitary gland, which is also part of the brain, but it's also a gland that secretes hormones into the bloodstream to affect other parts of the endocrine system. Okay, so we're going to talk a bit about the thyroid gland. We'll talk about the pancreas when we're reviewing diabetes. We'll talk about hormones that control the testicles and the ovaries. The adrenal gland is another important gland. We won't talk so much about the thymus. We discussed the thymus when we were talking about maturation of T lymphocytes. Okay, so the thymus can be considered a gland, but its main role is maturation of the T lymphocytes in the immune system. Okay, and finally, the pineal gland, we won't spend too much time on that gland either. Okay, so when we're talking about the endocrine system, we're talking about glands that secrete hormones. Okay, and it's a slower system than, say, the autonomic nervous system, where the sympathetic or the parasympathetic nerves can cause immediate changes, say in heart rate, respiratory rate, or blood pressure. Okay, the endocrine system responds more slowly. Okay, so it's a slower onset system. The hormones that are secreted have to have an effect on their target tissues. Okay, so it just takes longer for that to occur. And remember, the hormones have to get into the bloodstream first. They have to circulate in the bloodstream and then get to the target tissues and have their effect there. Okay, and a lot of these hormones that we'll be talking about, what's the main role of them? Well, we come back to maintaining homeostasis within the body. Okay, so remember that term when you're thinking about the different hormones that we're talking about and their role. And it's really about the body wanting to maintain homeostasis. Okay, a lot of the hormones will have feedback loops. So what does that mean? So, for example, the hypothalamus and the pituitary, they send out hormones that control other organs in the system. So let's say, for example, the ovaries, just as an example. Well, the pituitary sends out hormones to regulate the secretion of estrogen and progesterone from the ovaries. And how do the levels of those two hormones get controlled? Well, there's a feedback loop where estrogen and progesterone can then, because they get secreted into the bloodstream, they can then go back to the pituitary in the hypothalamus and inhibit further secretion of the stimulating hormones that are causing them to be secreted. So we would call that a negative feedback loop. And that allows estrogen and progesterone, to be kept at a certain level in the bloodstream. Otherwise, if there was constant stimulation from the hypothalamus and the pituitary, the estrogen and progesterone levels would just continue to go up and up and up. So you need that negative feedback loop to turn off the stimulation from the hypothalamus and the pituitary. Okay? So a lot of these systems have what are called negative feedback loops. There are a couple that we'll talk about that have a positive feedback loop. And that'll make more sense as we get to those slides. Okay, so I already mentioned this, but when we're comparing hormones versus neurotransmitters, well, if we're thinking of hormones, they get secreted into the bloodstream from certain glands. Okay, so let's use insulin as an example from the pancreas. Well, it gets secreted in the setting of high serum glucose. And then the insulin has to act on the cells of the body to allow glucose to enter cells. Okay, so it takes a bit of time for that to happen. And that goes for basically all the endocrine hormones we'll be talking about. Whereas the minute to minute or the second to second adjustment of heart rate, blood pressure, respiratory rate is extremely fast through the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. Okay, so when we're thinking of the use of nerves for rapid changes and controlling of homeostasis, using neurotransmitters such as epinephrine or norepinephrine, which will be the sympathetic system, and acetylcholine, which is used more in the parasympathetic system and also at the neuromuscular junction. Those are very fast responses, okay? So your heart rate can easily change within seconds to minutes because the nervous system has such a rapid response. Okay, so let's look at the setup of some glands now, okay? Let's look at the pituitary gland. So as I mentioned, the pituitary gland is a tiny little gland that's a bit larger than the size of a pea that lives in the brain, okay? And it's connected to the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus, again, which is part of the brain, can communicate with the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland can then release an assortment of hormones into the bloodstream to control different organs. Okay? So I really think of the hypothalamic pituitary system as the master system that's controlling many other hormones in the body. Okay? So the pituitary gland is made up of the anterior pituitary gland and the posterior pituitary gland. And we'll get into more details about what's secreted into the bloodstream from the anterior and the posterior pituitary gland in upcoming slides. The adrenal glands, they live on top of the kidneys, okay? And they're going to be responsible for secreting different hormones. As an example, the adrenal gland secretes cortisol, it secretes aldosterone, it also secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay, the thyroid gland lives in the anterior neck. Okay, so basically it wraps around the trachea, and it has two lobes on each side. Or sorry, it has two lobes, one on each side of the neck. And it's going to be responsible for secreting thyroid hormone. Okay. The ovaries I mentioned, they secrete progesterone and estrogen, and they're located in the pelvis in women. Okay. And the testicles, which will secrete testosterone, are located in the scrotum. Okay. Lastly, the pancreas, it's located high in the upper abdomen and very deep in. Okay, so it's actually behind the duodenum, and it's going to be responsible for secreting insulin and glucagon. And remember, it also has its exocrine function of secreting digestive juices into the gastrointestinal tract, okay, for digestion of different foods, okay? So when we're talking about hormones that are circulating in the bloodstream, well, what are the hormones going to affect? Well, they're going to affect tissues and cells that have receptors to that specific hormone, okay? So if some cells don't have the receptors, then they won't be impacted by a particular hormone. So remember that concept that there's hormones in your bloodstream, but not every cell is going to have receptors to respond to any one particular hormone, okay? So it's really the receptors that determine if a cell will respond to a certain hormone or not. Okay, so it's a bit like the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Once you know where the receptors are, well, then you know where the sympathetic nervous system is going to impact the body, and you know where the parasympathetic system will impact the body. Okay? Okay, so let's just talk a bit more about target cells. So when we're saying target cells, those are cells that have a specific protein, often in their cell membrane, that will bind a certain hormone and then have a certain effect on that group of cells. Okay, so the hormone binds to the receptor, and then has a specific effect within the cell. Okay, and we would call those target cells. Okay, so let me give you an example. So estrogen and progesterone. So we'll keep on the ovary theme here. Estrogen and progesterone have receptors for them in the uterus, right? In the endometrium, the inner lining of the uterus. So estrogen and progesterone can have some of their effects on the inner lining of the uterus because there's receptors there for those hormones. So estrogen can promote cellular division and increase tissue of the endometrium, so thickens the lining of the endometrium, preparing for a potential pregnancy. And progesterone, another hormone secreted by the ovary, can mature the cells. So its role is more in maturation of the endometrial lining to, again, prepare for a potential pregnancy. Okay, so that's just an example, but just to understand the concept of, sure, there's all kinds of hormones circulating through the bloodstream. Which cells do they affect? Well, it depends if cells have the receptors for those specific hormones. Okay, so let's look at the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And let's just talk about the anatomy a bit. So this is a pretty amazing system, considering that the pituitary gland is really a tiny little gland, okay? But it has so many functions. So if we look at this slide, we can see the hypothalamus at the top, and there's a blood supply at the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus can secrete hormones that travel down the blood supply to the pituitary gland, in particular the anterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus can send hormones to stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to produce its hormones and send them out into the bloodstream. Okay, so we would call that the hypothalamic pituitary portal system. It's the blood supply between the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary that allows the hypothalamus to send its hormones to then stimulate the anterior pituitary to secrete its hormones into the bloodstream and have its effects on different target organs or different target receptors on cells. Okay, so the anterior pituitary is really controlled by the hypothalamus through a blood supply. Okay, let's look at the other part of the pituitary, the posterior pituitary. So there's nerves in the hypothalamus that travel to the posterior pituitary. Okay, so the hypothalamus also has the ability to make certain hormones that travel from the hypothalamus and they get stored in the posterior pituitary. So in actual fact, the posterior pituitary is a storage area for certain hormones that we'll get into. And then those hormones that have been stored in the posterior pituitary, such as antidiuretic hormone, can then be sent into the bloodstream from the posterior pituitary. So in actual fact, ADH is made in the hypothalamus and sent down through this nervous system to the posterior pituitary for storage, and then it can be secreted into the systemic circulation. Okay, so the anterior and posterior pituitary are slightly different in terms of how they communicate with each other. The anterior is through a blood supply where hormones from the hypothalamus can travel to the anterior pituitary and stimulate release of hormones from the anterior pituitary, whereas the posterior pituitary is more of an extension of the nerves from the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamic hormones are stored in the posterior pituitary and then secreted into the bloodstream. So the posterior pituitary doesn't really make hormones. It's more of a storage area for hormones. Okay, so let's just look at the hypothalamus a bit more closely. Okay, we'll come to the pituitary for sure, but let's look at the hypothalamus. So the general purpose, maintaining homeostasis of the body through hormone regulation and neural networks with the brain. So when we're talking about hormone regulation, we're talking about its role with the pituitary gland, where it can send hormones to the anterior pituitary that can be that stimulates the anterior pituitary to send out hormones into the blood, okay? And then the posterior pituitary It can send hormones there to then be stored there until they're ready to be released, such as antidiuretic hormone. Okay. So where's the location of the hypothalamus? Well, it's in a part of the brain called the diencephalon. You can look that up on Google just to see where it is, and actually see how small the pituitary gland is that hangs down from the hypothalamus. Okay. Now the hypothalamus is part of the brain. It has other functions as well. So it definitely has this neuroendocrine function with the pituitary gland, okay? And we'll talk a lot more about that. But it also has other functions. So the hypothalamus has autonomic nervous system functions unrelated to the pituitary gland. So it's involved in controlling heart rate, vasoconstriction of blood vessels, digestive system, sweating. Okay, so it's partly involved in controlling the autonomic nervous system. It also controls body temperature. If you remember, inflammation in the body can cause the hypothalamus to reset the body temperature, right? The hypothalamus is also involved in certain emotions, such as anger. It's involved in appetite. And it's involved in what we call circadian rhythms of the body. So think of the hypothalamus as, yep, it has the ability to interact with the pituitary gland in terms of its endocrine function, but it also has nervous system functions as well, okay? So I think what you're going to see is, as we go through these slides, there's definitely going to be some repetition. But I really think with the endocrine system, repetition is important for you to really understand the system, okay? So let's look at the hypothalamus, and let's call it the master gland, okay? And there's a system that is called the hypothalamic pituitary axis, okay, where hormones from the hypothalamus will then go to the pituitary gland, and then the pituitary gland will then send out hormones to the systemic circulation, okay? So you can think of the hypothalamus as a link from the nervous system to the endocrine system, i.e. the pituitary gland, okay? So the hypothalamus will send out hormones that are able to control the anterior pituitary gland hormone secretion, and also the hypothalamus can also produce hormones that are then stored in the posterior pituitary, okay? Let's go just a bit lower than the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland. It produces hormones that circulate throughout the bloodstream to have their effect on target organs, okay? And where are the target organs? Well, they're all over the body. What determines what a target organ is for a specific hormone? Whether it has the receptors on its cells, okay? Okay, so let's look at this incredible system between the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. And remember, anterior pituitary, blood supply from the hypothalamus. Posterior pituitary has nerve extensions from the hypothalamus that then can store its hormones in the posterior pituitary, okay? So let's start on the left and just have a look at some hormones that are secreted by the anterior pituitary. So growth hormone is secreted by the anterior pituitary, and that's going to have a significant effect on, say, the growth of a child. And it's going to impact bone growth, tissue growth, muscle growth. So we can think of growth hormone as exactly what it does. It stimulates growth of tissues. We'll get into more details about it later. Okay, another hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. Okay, well, that's a hormone that is released by the anterior pituitary, and it has an effect on its target organ called the adrenal cortex. Okay, so the adrenal cortex is the outer part of the adrenal gland. The inner part, called the adrenal medulla, that secretes epinephrine and norepinephrine. The outer part secretes cortisol, okay? And also what are called mineralocorticoids that we will recognize the name by aldosterone. Okay, so adrenal cortex, aldosterone, and cortisol, the adrenal medulla, norepinephrine, and epinephrine. Okay, so ACTH is responsible for controlling cortisol secretion by the adrenal cortex. Thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. So TSH is secreted by the anterior pituitary. Where's its target cells? The thyroid gland. Okay, and when TSH binds to the thyroid gland, it will release thyroid hormone, T4, into the bloodstream to have its effect on all the cells in the body that have receptors for thyroid hormone. So really the role of TSH from the anterior pituitary is just to stimulate the thyroid gland to secrete its hormones into the bloodstream. Okay, gonadotropic hormones. So that's FSH, which is follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, which is luteinizing hormone. And these stimulate the gonads. Okay, so they will stimulate the ovaries to release estrogen and progesterone, and they will stimulate the testicles to produce and secrete testosterone into the bloodstream to have their effects on their target cells. Okay, the next one is prolactin. Now, prolactin is most associated with milk production in the breast. Okay, so for example, a nursing infant will stimulate, when nursing, will stimulate further prolactin production from the anterior pituitary, which will allow more milk production to occur. So prolactin is responsible not only for milk production for a nursing infant, but during pregnancy, it also helps with mammary gland stimulation and growth. Okay, so I would think of prolactin as the hormone that develops the mammary glands, enlarges them during pregnancy, and also is responsible for milk production. Okay, so now let's go to the posterior pituitary. So the posterior pituitary has two hormones, which are stored there. They were sent there by the hypothalamus. So the first one is oxytocin. And oxytocin, some of its main responsibilities are at the mammary glands, where it allows what's called milk letdown. So it allows the secretion of milk into the ducts of the breast tissue to allow for milk to be released for the infant. Okay. Oxytocin is also responsible for uterine smooth muscle contractions. So during labor, oxytocin helps with uterine contractions. And what does that do? It helps to dilate the cervix for the infant or for the child to be delivered. Okay? So those are the two main roles of oxytocin. So what will produce more oxytocin? Well, what about a nursing infant? So a nursing infant will stimulate the nipples of the breast, which will then travel through nerves back to the hypothalamus that can then produce more oxytocin that will then be secreted by the posterior pituitary to allow more milk let down and more milk release into the breast ducts. So that's a perfect example of positive feedback, right? That's a positive feedback loop, meaning when the infant nurses, that's going to stimulate an increase in oxytocin secretion from the posterior pituitary. Now, what else does oxytocin do to the uterus? So after birth, and the infant is nursing, okay, well, I just mentioned that it's going to allow for more milk let down into the breast ducts. Well, oxytocin is also going to stimulate the uterus after delivery to contract further down. So that's why some women get pelvic cramps with nursing, because the oxytocin is stimulating the uterus to contract harder and harder. And what that really allows to happen is that there's less postpartum bleeding, right? Because the uterus is contracting down due to the oxytocin. So that's a pretty amazing system. Not only does the oxytocin allow for milk letdown after delivery, it also ensures that the uterus continues to contract and stop potential postpartum bleeding. Now, oxytocin also has an effect on certain parts of the brain. So we call it the love hormone because after delivery, there's an increase in oxytocin, and that has effects on parts of the brain to increase social bonding, especially with the infant, right? So not only does oxytocin get secreted into the bloodstream, but it has an effects within. It has some of its effects within the brain as well. Now, oxytocin is also increased during sexual stimulation. So remember, it's also called the love hormone. There's an increase in oxytocin levels during the human sexual response. Okay, so oxytocin has quite a few effects, right? Don't forget that bonding effect that oxytocin has between an infant and the mother. That's important. It actually has some effects of maternal behavior, which of course is important after delivery. Okay, now lastly, antidiuretic hormone. Okay, so again, stored in the posterior pituitary and released when there is elevated osmolarity or elevated concentrations of ions in the bloodstream, and the body wants to reabsorb water from the kidneys to dilute the excessive plasma concentration. Okay, so antidiuretic hormone is secreted by the posterior pituitary. It works on the collecting ducts and partly the distal convoluted tubule to reabsorb more fluid, thereby diluting plasma concentration in the setting of an overly concentrated plasma. So let me give you an example. If I eat a lot of salt right now, I'm going to increase my sodium in my bloodstream. So yes, that's going to definitely stimulate a thirst reflex for me to go and drink water, right? And that's going to help dilute the plasma and maintain my serum sodium level. But ADH is also going to be secreted by the posterior pituitary to reabsorb fluid from the kidneys to also try and dilute the plasma because of the excessive salt that I just ate. Okay.